What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you 5 of my favorite stories in gaming, a subject I haven't touched upon in a couple of years, I believe. And given that I have played and reviewed over 100 plus games since then, I thought it would be fun to double back and touch on this subject and talk about some stories that really stuck with me even after I was done playing said games. With that in mind, a couple of things here at the beginning. I'm very aware that Planescape Torment and the like have fantastic stories, things like Red Dead Redemption 2. I've talked about those before, I love them as stories, and if I were to rank just a list of pure best ones, they'd probably be up at the top. But as I mentioned, I've already talked about them previously, so I don't feel the need to add them to this list again, but I do realize people are going to ask about them, so there that is. Secondly, it's very difficult to talk about a subject like this without spoiling something, which means this is the kind of thing I don't really mention in reviews outside of much more general things. So there's definitely going to be a few spoilers for the games we're about to talk about, so you might want to check the timestamps to look at what games we're going to mention, just in case you don't want to hear any of those, because yeah, fair enough. Now with all of that said, let's actually dive into it and talk about a few of these. So first up, we have a very recent one, which was actually what inspired me to talk about this subject again, and that was actually Banishers, Ghosts of New Eden. A narrative-focused action-adventure from Don't Nod, the same people behind Vampire, which is relevant because Banishers is all about investigating ghosts who have attached themselves to the living and need to be sent on their way to whatever afterlife awaits them, and you'll have some say in dictating what that actually winds up being, which is where the game's choice and consequence comes into play, because we play as Red McWraith, whose lover, Antea, is dead at the beginning of the game following a short prologue, but she then goes on to become a ghost herself, attaching herself to none other than Red, which is obviously a problem as his job is to get rid of ghosts. And this puts you both on a long adventure to potentially do just that, but that's where the story part of it really comes in, and that is making the choice to either banish Antea, send her on, if you will, or perform a very risky ritual to bring her back to life, which actually involves you having to essentially kill everyone you can along the way while you investigate these ghost stories throughout the actual story. And while that's a pretty interesting setup all on its own, throughout the game you'll be learning more about both of our protagonists, growing closer, interacting with them both in basically every cutscene as you kind of switch back and forth between them as you play through the game. So you get a very intimate look at their relationship before having to make all these decisions and stick by your word one way or the other, which leads to a very moving scenario because of how this relationship is presented and the choice that you inevitably know is coming. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given that Don't Nod is behind a few of, I would say, my favorite narrative experiences recently, this one is very good, and I enjoyed the story of this game more than anything else about it. Which brings us to our second entry, which is actually Colony Ship, a CRPG that released last year. And while it does feature tactical turn-based combat, my favorite thing about it was the story and the simple premise of it. You see, Colony Ship takes place on a generational ship. A ship traveling through space to a different planet that we are hoping to set up a colony on, and our character, theoretically, will never see this destination. Having been born on this ship, they are most likely going to die on it, which is the case for everyone else on the ship who is merely trying to scrape by in the wake of a rebellion from the ship's original mission that then led to all sorts of different factions popping up, each after their own goals and what they plan to do on whether or not they should even bother trying to reach said planet or accept the nihilism that is pretty rampant in a case like this, which is just a wonderful premise to set up a game. And that's before you even start talking about the, I would say, more bizarre elements like the mutant colony that runs the engines, the cyborgs that control the life support systems, and throughout the game we're going to be making all sorts of decisions about our interactions with each of these factions and dealing with the consequences therein, and getting to both explore just how day-to-day life is being lived on this ship, how people are scraping by in the wake of all that nihilism I mentioned, and then that's to say nothing of the giant twist at the end, which is going to recontextualize basically everything up to that point, led to a lot of really striking moments that I think really made that game something beyond just its obviously pretty indie roots. I think they were really onto something with that story and that setting, which is great because realistically the combat isn't going to be for everyone, which is the case for Iron Tower Studios games for sure, but they do have a demo so you could try it out for yourself if you think you might be interested. Moving on to our third entry though, we then have Days Gone, believe it or not, a game that I enjoyed the story of more than just about anything else it did. I thought the open world and some of the activities were pretty bland, but Days Gone's story is a very, I would say, roller coaster-esque experience with a lot of ups and downs. We play as Deacon St. John, who, alongside his friend Boozer, is just trying to live the best they can in a post-apocalyptic Oregon after your pretty traditional zombie plague outbreak killed most everyone outside of pockets of survivors, generally just banding together and trying to get by. But what I loved about the story of this one is, as I mentioned, that roller coaster. Deacon St. John here lost his wife Sarah, as far as he knew at the beginning of the game, to a very rough stab wound that caused him to believe, without seeing her body, that, she was very much so probably dead. And much of the beginning of the game is dealing with that, this person who's pretty much broken, leaning on his best friend, without any real purpose in what is effectively a doomed world. Though, as you start interacting with more and more camps and societies, you start finding some of that reason for living again, people you connect with, people worth, waking up every day for, so to speak. And then right at the height of that, you then suddenly discover that Sarah is not dead. She's very much so alive. And naturally, you have to go see how that concludes, which leads to Deacon St. John joining up with a dangerous religious paramilitary organization that his wife, Sarah, is also involved with. Though how fanatical they actually are, it becomes apparent over the course of the story, which then leads to this other huge conflict, only to then end the game on a massive cliffhanger. And it's just a game full of so many ups and downs in terms of its story that I think it's a real shame that the rest of the open world didn't really support it, because while I wasn't extremely wild about playing Days Gone, I really did love the story of that game. Which brings us to number 4, Fallout New Vegas. Now, for those who are wondering why a game like that is on this list, I mean, it has a great story, but what you may not be aware of is that I had actually never played New Vegas for a very long time. It wasn't until I started doing this channel full-time that I ever got the chance to actually play it. Bit of a long story, but the very short version is I was very poor growing up, didn't get to play a lot of video games, so there was a massive amount of popular titles from like 2000 to 2010 that I just never touched. And when I started doing this full-time, I immediately jumped into that stuff because that was the stuff I wanted to play the most. It was kind of my own personal backlog that I finally had the time to go through, and New Vegas was one of the games on that list. And it certainly did not disappoint. From the game's very strong opening of the courier getting shot to waking up in the Mojave Wasteland, only to then learn about the factions, how their infighting has shaped the area, and while it might initially seem like a case of just purely good guys versus purely bad guys, and while in many ways it kind of still is, there's more to it than that. For instance, the NCR is painfully inept at basically everything they do. They're causing many of their own problems. Contrast it against Caesar's Legion, who brings rigid order everywhere they go, however, at the same time are then enslaving people and treating women like dirt, and all of that before you even start talking about New Vegas itself, led by House, of course, which is deliberately bleeding the NCR dry in basically every way. And then there's all the minor factions, which are themselves flailing in every direction, and the story of New Vegas, to me at least, is really about the courier coming in and, with firm decisions one way or another, making sense of all this, and for better or worse, taking the Mojave Wasteland in a direction, instead of being perpetually stuck where it is at the time you show up. And all the choice and consequences you're going to make along the way in dealing with all of that, which factions to aid, which to hinder, etc., is really what I think makes Fallout New Vegas so great. Moving right along to our final entry, however, we then have Pentiment. A bit different, I would say, than many of the other games on this list, and it was a very popular narrative release, though admittedly still a bit niche. And what I love about the story of this game, with it primarily being a murder mystery set across decades, is its historical context. So this particular game is set in 16th century Bavaria, and it really leans into that setting to explore what daily life was like for all different walks of life at that time, from nobles to monks to simple townsfolk. And then as the game progresses, decades pass and you get to see that same town across different eras and how things change and move. And that's before we even start actually talking about the story and the murder investigations, as you are in this town playing as Andreas, an illustrator who, over the course of his career, encounters a few murders in Tassing, the town here. And you have to investigate and try to basically sway the investigation one way or the other. And then that culminates into a fairly surprising twist at the end that really changes the context of the murder investigations. And what I loved about this so much is that it kept me guessing right up until the end. As I mentioned in my review, and I don't want to spoil like literally the ending of it, I was correct about the who, I was very, very wrong about the how. But realistically, what I love most about Pentiment is that it was simply unique. You see, I've played and reviewed hundreds of games at this point, and while I still enjoy them very much, and I really couldn't do this channel if I didn't, what stands out to me the most these days when I look at a game is whether or not it does anything I haven't seen before. And given the historical context of this one, and taking a look at all these different things and the nature of that murder investigation, and then all of the more psychological aspects of it with things like the fonts of the writing changing and the exploration of the trauma experienced by our own character throughout the years, makes for an incredibly compelling narrative experience, which is why it is one of my favorite stories. But that, I think, is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So there has been an update of sorts to some of my favorite stories in gaming now that I've been reviewing games full-time for a couple of years. I thought that would be fun to share, and I certainly hope you got something out of it. So do let me know what your favorite stories in gaming are. I'm expecting Planescape Torment, of course, probably Disco Elysium somewhere in there, I'm sure. I'd love to know what you guys enjoy, or simply how you feel about these ones. Either way, that's pretty much going to do it for me though, so I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.